Hey, Juan here. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the difference between working in a small, medium, or large tech companies. Or maybe most of you are interested in the difference between working in a startup and a large company. So when I cover a small company, I'm also going to be covering a startup company, especially startups which are in the very early stages, not startups that have grown a lot and have become the unicorns already. So what are going to be the differences mainly between working in small companies, medium companies, and large companies? Mainly it will come to the responsibilities that you have or that you can take. If you work in a small company, typically you are going to have to cover many different roles, because small companies typically don't have the budget to actually hire a ton of people, which means that people that have been hired for a certain position might have to actually work with roles that actually belong to different positions or will belong to a different position in a bigger company. So for example, if you are a data scientist, if you are a marketing person in a smaller company, most likely you are going to have to take all the responsibilities from the data science point of view. So you will have to potentially build the pipelines, you will potentially have to build the data lakes, cleaning the data, actually starting to do some analytics using some simple machine learning algorithms. And if you are in marketing, most likely you are going to have to do quite many marketing tasks. Potentially you have to do product marketing, you might have to do marketing automation, you probably had to do to a certain degree communication, and potentially you also had to do branding. So in a small company, what it means is that you are going to have to actually take many hats that usually in a bigger company you wouldn't do that. In a medium-sized company, positions are actually going to be much more well-defined, which means that the responsibilities that you have defined between when you sign your role or for your position are actually going to be typically the ones that you are going to continue working with. Of course, companies evolve, things change over time, but they are relatively settled, at least for a certain amount of time. This means that, for example, if you are doing data science, probably you are focusing more on the actual data science part. So you are working with the analytics part, you might be working with machine learning. There might be other things that you would take, but most likely are going to be quite well defined on what are the roles that you are going to be working. And the same goes for the example of product marketing, marketing. You probably are going to be focusing on just one area. It might be just product marketing, it might be marketing automation. You might take quite many responsibilities within that role that you have, but that's a different story. You typically are not going to have to work, for example, in branding, except maybe as a collaborator or as a stakeholder, but you're probably not going to be the one that has the responsibility to drive those projects. And that's something that in small companies or in startups is going to happen, where you are actually going to have to be the one that is driving that kind of projects. And when you go to a large company, then it's going to get even more specialized and well-defined what kind of role you are taking and what are the responsibilities of that role within the company. So for example, if you are again the data scientist, you most likely are going to only have to work, for example, in analytics, potentially the analytics for a very specific product. If you are in product marketing, you are going to actually be working in the product marketing for a specific product or part of a bigger product. And you are going to concentrate on just focusing on how to promote the best that kind of content to your customers or to your potential customers. So what's the difference in reality from the small company or the startup company all the way to the large company? Big companies are going to have a ton of money to expend in resources, which means that potentially can put much more focus on a project and much more focus, for example, in researching, data science, in marketing and promoting their content to potential new customers. Whereas in the smaller companies, in the startups, it's going to be quite hard to have all these people that actually can take all these different roles in order to do kind of a similar work. Which means that it's very difficult then from that point of view to shine as a startup or as a small company, because you're competing to a company that has a ton of resources. But here the important thing is that how can you make the best out of what you have? So that's the focus that you have to have in a small company. How can you be more creative and different from what a big company is? Big companies typically are going to be much more stiff and much more difficult to steer in a different direction. So smaller companies, basically this is like life. If you have a small car, you compare it to a train, probably a train is not the best. Probably a train is not the best analogy. Let's take a big truck. If you have a small car or if you have a big truck, A small car is going to be much more maneuverable and you can move around easily, but a big truck is not going to be able to maneuver so well. On the other hand, the big truck is going to be able to carry a bigger load, obviously, whereas the smaller car, it won't be able to do that. So there's going to be the advantages and the disadvantages in both sides. So now let's talk about the advantages. What are going to be the advantages of working in a small company? Obviously, when you're in a small company, as I said earlier, you're going to be able to move much faster and change directions. This can be a disadvantage or an advantage, depends on your personality. But the reality is that there is much more opportunities for you to actually make an impact on the company. When you're a small size company, the contributions of individuals are always going to have much more impact than the contributions of individuals in large companies. Because obviously you represent a much larger proportion of the company than in a bigger company you will represent. The other thing is that in a small company, the possibilities of changing your role, of affecting other areas of the company are going to be much bigger. And this can be very, very interesting for a person that wants to learn, that wants to change the way of working, that wants to affect how the company is working, that wants to affect the business. In a small company, the impact that you can deliver is always going to be much higher compared to a bigger company. Again, small company, pretty much the same as a startup in this case. In a medium company, you are going to have some potential of changing your role, but it's going to be already more structured. It's going to be maybe not so easy as it is in a smaller company. The advantage potentially of a medium company is that it can be a comfortable place to work. It doesn't have the challenges of a small company. It doesn't have maybe the potentially strict bureaucracy that some big companies have. And don't get me wrong, not all the big companies actually have a strict bureaucracy, especially in tech world, but some will do. It is kind of a nice comfort place of being able to affect to a certain degree, but not being in a place where things might be changing at a relatively fast pace for certain people. In a medium company, there's also going to be potential for career path or development in your career. So that's going to be something that still exists there. And in some companies, this is going to be very well planned, where they actually look into what is the potential development of people, how can we help them grow in their actual roles, especially looking for the people that are very high performers, and how can you actually motivate them to stay within the company and help them grow within the company. So these things, if a company is in a good place and it has the proper culture, these things can happen, and that's actually something really nice. In a large company, you are actually typically going to be able to focus much more on the work that you do. So this is going to be an advantage. So if you want to shine and you want to learn and you want to grow as a data scientist, you probably can do it quite well in a big company. And it depends on the type of company. If a company is actually really agile, you are going to have the potential of actually change roles and get new responsibilities, because agile teams tend to actually promote learning, promote development. In a big company with more stiff or more bureaucracy, this might not be so easy. It might be more static and more set, the position that you actually have. But potentially one of the advantages of working in a large company is that you're going to be able to focus a lot on what you are doing. And potentially you are going to be able to learn a lot on the years that you are in that position. Let's say that you're a couple of years, 3-4 years in the same position, you are going to be able to learn a lot if you have the will to do that. And this can help you then moving forward and finding newer positions later on in your career. The disadvantages of working in a small company is they're going to be kind of the opposite from the bigger ones. So probably what you are not going to be able to do is to focus on your work. Many times you are going to have to jump from one task to another, sometimes tasks that are completely unrelated to the point, even from the point of view of actually working. Maybe one day, if you think about the example of the product marketing, one day you are working in promoting certain new features in the product, and then the next day you actually had to be driving some marketing automation or potentially some branding campaigns which is not very related to the product marketing job. So it can be quite all over the place and it can be quite hectic sometimes. Ironically, I was talking that moving positions can be easy, but sometimes it can be also quite difficult because since there's not that many people in the company, there's not that many people potentially leaving the company, which means that new positions don't get vacant. And if the company is not growing and revenues are not growing fast, then potentially the company cannot increase headcount, they cannot increase the number of employees that they have, which means that you potentially might get stuck in your position and not be able to move forward in your career, especially if you want to move up the ladder, if you call it that way. And it also can be quite challenging if you are not comfortable with a changing environment. If it's something that is not comfortable for you, so potentially working in a small company or a startup is not going to be for you. In a startup, it's going to be different, especially if it's a fast-growing startup. Because in a fast-growing startup, obviously revenue is increasing, the company is growing, so potentially they are going to be able to hire new people and actually grow the team, which means that if you're within the startup, you might be able to move forward in your career at a very fast pace because things might change really fast. On the other hand, well, yeah, the disadvantage is that things might move really, really fast, which means that you might double the amount of people in 1 year or even more. And growth is not so easy to deal with, especially if you want to keep a certain culture that you have in the company. The disadvantages of being in a medium company are actually going to be that potentially you can get too comfortable. Medium companies, depends on the company, it's going to be different how they're growing or they are not growing, or they might be even shrinking on size. If they are not growing, especially if they are not growing at a good rate, potentially they are not going to be opening new positions, so it might be quite a stagnant sentence in the company. So this is something to know and to take into consideration. If it gets too comfortable, it means that many people potentially in the company are too comfortable, meaning that potentially the company culture is becoming a little bit of like a dinosaur company. So you have to think about it. What kind of company do you want to be in? And what kind of company do you think suits more the way that your personality is? And the fact that a company is stagnant or that the company is not growing might mean that you actually don't have potential career development. And by the way, don't take the career development just as I had to be a manager type of thing. We all like to learn new things. We are all tend to be interested in moving forward in our careers. This doesn't mean that you have to be a manager, that you have to be a VP, or that you have to be the CEO of the company. I'm not talking about that career development necessarily. It might be that typically if you're a curious person, you are going to be wanting to do a certain type of job for some years. After 3 or 4 years, you start to get curious and then you want to move forward because you have learned enough about a certain position and actually you have started learning about other positions and you would like to move forward in your career. And sorry for the rant, we move forward. So what are the disadvantages of working in a large tech company? So potentially here you can be disappearing in the background noise of the company. There might be a lot of people that are doing a lot of things and potentially it might be that your work is not so noticeable as you would hope it to be. But the reality is that many times this is on you. That's something that maybe sometimes is not so easy to notice, but we have to also be able to understand when our work is relevant or not, and if it's not relevant, how can we change it to actually make it relevant to the rest of the people in the company, so we actually make an impact and deliver value for the company. Because in the end, everything is like a product. Products are useful when they deliver value to somebody, and the same is our work. We just deliver value to the company and the company delivers value to the users, and that's how the work works. Of course, the fact that I was talking earlier that one of the advantages is the focus to be able to concentrate on some kind of work, that might be also a disadvantage, especially once you start to get potentially tired of that kind of job. Then it might be time to be repetitive as a job and maybe it's not so interesting for you anymore. When talking about large companies, there can be lots of different types of large companies. Of course, there's the typical large companies like the FANG, but that's a very specific type of large company, which are going still a very fast pace compared to other large companies. There's going to be other large companies which are potentially not so innovative and not so much moving at a fast pace as those ones are, and they might be more traditional or potentially more stagnant, and potentially there might be not so much growth within the company. So remember, those are groups are going to be different, and potentially there's going to be different aspects to them as well. So I'm not going to say which one is better. You have to find what's best for you. You have to understand what kind of environment that you like. Do you like a company that is more steady or potentially predictable, or are you more thrilled for a company that is changing all the time and potentially has many risks involved in the company? Think about a startup. Or do you prefer the other company which is more stable, where you can actually develop your career, maybe a slower path, but it has a good name and potentially is going to look also good in your CV? So you have to balance this, and you have to understand what kind of career do you prefer. And maybe the answer is not even what is that you want, and you don't have to stick to one of these. Potentially you want to change during your career. So in the beginning, maybe you are more thrilled about a startup, and the longer term you might be more thrilled about a bigger company. And it might happen the other way around. For me, actually, I came from a medium-sized company. I went down to a smaller company. It's not a startup, but it's a fast-growing small company. So it's probably closer to what a startup is doing. So you have to understand what kind of company you like at different types of your career or your development as a person or as a professional. So no correct answer as typically, because it always will depend on the situation that you are at and what are your interests. If you find value in the video, please give it a like. It helps a lot the channel. Let us know in what kind of company do you work. Do you work in a tech company for starters? And if you work in a tech company, is it a small company? Is it a startup, a medium size, or a large company? Let us know in the comments below. I will see you in the next video, and remember, stay safe.